Professor Kimberly is from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thank you for coming on the programme. Look, in a nutshell, what's the best case and the worst case scenario here for global trade?
I think the best case scenario is that the Trump administration backs down from the more ambitious versions of their plans and does the most narrow version possible. I think this is a huge self-goal for the United States. It's going to hurt our consumption, our investment, our macroeconomy, and U.S. consumers and workers. But it also hurts some of our closest partners and allies disproportionately. So Canada, Mexico, Korea, Japan, these are all examples of countries that have worked really well with the United States on a host of problems. So I think the best case would be to ratchet that down. Worst case scenario, they do something very aggressive, like a broad 20% tariff on all of the trading partners. That could be quite harmful. On the consumption side, that's the largest tax increase in more than a generation, so that's going to hurt consumers and households in the U.S. economy. It's also a pretty regressive tax that'll hurt poorer people more. On the production side, it will create waves of retaliation that hurt our exporters, and it will put a big monkey wrench into U.S. supply chains, which rely on imported intermediate goods. The majority of our imports are intermediate goods. And one thing you see in that manufacturing report that was just alluded to on your show is a much increased price of these intermediate goods in manufacturing, indicating that that's a big cost shock for U.S. production and industry.
So a ripple effect, not just in the United States, though, but around the world. And as you say, some countries are more at risk than others in terms of the impact that this is all going to have. You know, as patterns shift to avoid tariffs, does anyone stand to benefit from the trade diversion effects?
If you look at some of the modeling, it looks like some countries, like perhaps Australia, could benefit from some elements of this if trading partners reorient some of their trade towards others. You know, and I think many countries in the world aren't that exposed to U.S. trade because we account for only about 13% of worldwide merchandise imports. So for many countries, they might be able to weather this by building stronger trade connections with each other, and we've seen some efforts in that direction in the past. Europe, for instance, opened many new trade agreements during the first Trump administration, partly to counter the threats of trade wars from the first Trump administration. I have less positive outlook for Canada and Mexico, who unfortunately are much more deeply dependent on the United States, but they'll be doing their best to reorient towards other countries of the world if this trade war occurs in its full glory.
You mentioned Europe there. I mean, what are the implications of EU retaliation?
So Europe and other countries will retaliate. That's certainly going to hurt U.S. exporters even more than the tariffs will. But the tariffs hurt them too, of course, because U.S. exporters are also big U.S. importers. Those are often the same firms. For Europe, there's a lot of new trading relationships that they can try to build, not just with each other and with the UK, but with Canada and Mexico and countries throughout the world. I suspect that this will also push the European Union, Japan, Korea, and others closer to China as they seek new trading partners that can be more reliable than the Trump administration at this particular time. But again, I think it depends a lot on the form that these tariffs take. And as you've noticed in your own reporting, there's a lot of uncertainty right now about whether this is the light version or the heavy version of these tariffs. And I think the rollout of these policy plans has been very chaotic and uncertain at all levels.
As you say, a lot hinges on what is actually announced on that so-called Liberation Day. But how and how soon will this trade and tariff turmoil reshape global trade flows as we know it?
Thank you, everybody.
I think that if, the tariffs end up being quite broad, we're going to see a big impact right away. But I think the big impact is mostly going to come in the form of recessionary headwinds for the United States, because this is such a large shock, it's such a large tax increase, and it's such a large supply chain disruption. That's going to reduce U.S. demand, in addition to the tariffs reducing U.S. demand. So that puts a big cloud over the whole world economy, because the United States is, a large economy that's going to have a big impact. So I'm hoping, like many, that the tariffs end up being smaller than some of the advertisements ahead of time have suggested.
Look, Trump says it's all about protecting US jobs, protecting US industry. But won't this tariff escalation lead to higher prices and fragmented supply chains, no matter how wide or narrow they end up being?
I agree. I think this is a negative policy for the United States, whether it's small or large, right? We saw, in fact, during the first Trump administration trade war, the full costs of those extra tariffs, which were mostly on Chinese products, but the full costs were borne by U.S. buyers of imports, right? So it was a big shock to U.S. consumption, and it also hurt U.S. production. Very careful analysis of that trade war episode showed that we lost more jobs in the exporting industries that were threatened with retaliation and due to supply chain disruption than were created by the protection from the tariffs. If we move to Trump 2 and imagine the same sort of experiment, but with the much bigger tax base where you're hitting now all of trade, all of trade is roughly 10 times the size of trade that was tariffed in the first Trump administration. So we'd expect, a much, much larger shock, both in terms of the tax, which would be thousands of dollars for the typical household, but also in terms of the disruption, which could easily provoke a steep recession.
Kimberly Klausing from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, thank you very much.
Thank you.